sentir la musique. Je peux sentir le jazz, ça me fait quelque chose.
Our topic lecture this morning, you will get to learn all about everything you ever wanted to know about this year's topic. It's going to be, no, you don't think so? You're not going to cover that in like an hour now? So Dr. Allison Harper here is our Associate Director of Debate at Emory University, and she also helps the trainings run on time for the 2-week program and helped to come up with the curriculum and the schedules and all of that. So, and she's been working hard on learning about the topic, and I'm sure you're going to learn a ton from her this morning. Let's welcome Allison.
All right, good morning, everybody. Today we're going to start our inquiry into this year's upcoming debate topic. As many of you know, in policy debate, we use the same debate resolution through the whole year. So the information that you learned this morning is stuff that will still be relevant when you are debating at the end of the year, whether that's at your last novice tournament or maybe even qualifying to the TOC. So the information that you have now and paying attention in this lecture will be really helpful when it comes to all of your future debates. We're going to focus some extra attention on the affirmative that you'll be reading during our camp, because that's the one that you need to know the quickest. But I also hope to give you an overview for what the resolution as a whole will look like, so that way you have some ideas about what other affirmative cases you might hear at the tournaments that you go to during the year. I'm going to pause a couple times through the lecture to give you a chance to ask me questions. So if there's something that you want to know more about, please feel free to, when I get to those points, ask questions. Or if you have something that's like really urgent, raise your hand and I will call on you. Let's get started. So this year's resolution is kind of a weird mashup of a resolution, right? It took two different ideas, one about emerging technologies and one about U.S. cooperation with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and kind of pushed them together into a topic wording that says the United States federal government should substantially increase its security cooperation with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in one or more of the following areas: artificial intelligence, biotechnology, or cybersecurity. Based on your first takes on this resolution, what are some of the things that you want to know more about, or you think might be things that you'll end up debating about when you get into this controversy? Yes? Substantially. Substantially. Okay, we have a future Kansas debater in the room. So yeah, it means that they need to not do a little tiny thing, right? They need to make some meaningful change in the way that the United States cooperates with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization on these issues. Yes?
Like the NATO key warrant?
NATO key warrant, love that, right. That'll be a thing that becomes really important, because this doesn't just say that the United States should have a new policy about biotech, right? It doesn't say that the United States should have its own ideas about artificial intelligence, but that it needs to work with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a political and military alliance, in order to make this kind of cooperation happen. Is there anything else in there that's interesting? Yeah.
Security cooperation and definition of security cooperation.
Yeah, security cooperation. What does it mean to cooperate on security? Does that mean that we can share some vitamins with our friends in NATO, or does that have a specific meaning? And so I think that there are a lot of parts of this resolution that are really interesting. We'll kind of talk through different areas of the topic this morning, and hopefully you'll have some ideas for what I think the overall resolution will look like when you debate it this year, and also some ideas for places that you might engage in future research after our camp is over. So I'm going to start by talking about the kind of 3 different emerging technologies, just because they're kind of distinct from the way that you would think about the NATO cooperation, security cooperation element of the topic. And so the 3 areas, again, are artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and cybersecurity. So artificial intelligence, or AI, is a wide-ranging branch of computer science that builds smart machines that are hopefully capable of performing tasks that are typically require a human to perform them, or require human intelligence. It usually works by creating rules or algorithms that are able to interpret large amounts of data. Usually things that AI is good at are performing really repetitive types of detailed-oriented tasks People, right, get distracted. You know, we don't want to look through spreadsheets on spreadsheets on spreadsheets. We suffer when you make us sit there and interpret lines of data or process picture after picture after picture. But AI doesn't get tired. It doesn't have ADHD, right? It's able to process large amounts of data faster and more consistently than humans are able to. It can also be expensive to develop, and there are a limited number of people who have the current skills to work on improving and building AI. Some concepts that I thought you would want to know about artificial intelligence is, one is the concept of strong versus weak AI. Weak AI is used to perform a single specific task, and I bet most of you have interacted with weak artificial intelligence in the past. For example, how many of you asked Siri to figure out how to get to this building this morning? You have called on AI to help you figure out where you're going, right? If you've ever asked Alexa to send you some snacks because you didn't like what was in the vending machine, you have called on weak artificial intelligence. If an email that you get about this camp got blocked in your spam filter, that's artificial intelligence because it has, you know, looked for patterns in subject lines and bodies of emails and tried to figure out what is junk email that you don't want versus real email that you do want to read. So weak AI is actually something that's all around us. It's something that we use on a pretty regular basis. You know, there are even computers that have been taught to beat the best humans at chess or Jeopardy. That's all weak AI. It all is designed to perform one single task. Help me find buildings, right, or get directions. Help me order stuff from Amazon. Help me win at Jeopardy is weak AI. Strong AI is also known as Artificial General Intelligence, or AGI. This is meant to replicate the cognitive abilities of humans, right? It's meant to be able to think. It is usually a bit more complex than the weak AI systems that we kind of interact with on a regular basis. So what does this have to do with security cooperation, and why would this be something that we would want to work with NATO on? There are a few different reports that talk about potential military applications of artificial intelligence. For example, the RAND Corporation recently published a book that outlines several ways in which military applications of AI will increase dramatically over the next couple of years. One of those areas is one that is pretty controversial. It's the use of lethal autonomous weapons. These are, you know, AI might be used in varying degrees to make decisions about how the military uses force, right? It might be used to identify targets. It might be the actual decision as to whether a weapon fires at an identified enemy. It might make full-scale adaptations to a different environment. The degree to which lethal autonomous weapons are under the control of AI is something that is definitely controversial in the literature. Some technologies are actually pretty old. Some lethal autonomous weapons, depending on how you define that term, have actually existed for a long time. Like, there are some authors that classify landmines as lethal autonomous weapons because a person doesn't have to make a decision as to whether a landmine fires, right? It fires whenever someone comes into contact with it. And so that's usually not what the folks who are talking about AI are talking about when they talk about lethal autonomous weapons. But there are also systems that use AI in them already, somewhere along the kind of spectrum of what a lethal autonomous weapon might do. For example, there are missile defense systems that already use artificial intelligence in their targeting, right? It would be really complicated for humans to figure out where an incoming missile is on its trajectory and do all the math calculations to figure out where it ought to fire. And so, you know, in some cases, AI is involved in targeting decisions for missile defense. You know, so there are varying degrees of autonomy that a weapon has. Some of the dicier ethical implications occur when we start talking about more and more autonomy being given to weapon systems and to artificial intelligence. So, you know, some of those controversies might ask questions like, what happens if an autonomous drone makes the decision to fire at someone and they have accidentally struck a civilian instead of, you know, an enemy combatant? That's something that would be a really unfortunate situation. Who's to blame when that happens? Is it the programmer? Is it the country that owns the drones? What sort of rules and regulations ought we have to prevent situations like that from occurring? You know, the question of how much control we can vest in those systems is definitely something that is debated in the literature. This RAND study suggests that Americans overall support the idea that the US military ought to have some form of artificial intelligence. You know, many Americans think that the US military ought to have the best weapon systems that they possibly can, that we ought to be able to compete on the international arena with other militaries, and that means being able to access contemporary and emerging technologies. But it's also very popular that there ought to be some restrictions on what artificial intelligence can do in the military, right? Most Americans don't like the idea of killer robots running amok, right? They've, you know, read some old science fiction, they've seen the Terminator, they don't want that to happen, right? And so most Americans, in terms of polling, support some sort of happy medium in terms of what lethal autonomous weapons can do. The current US ethical standards suggest that if AI is used in lethal applications, a person has to be involved in the decision making, and they have to be able to kind of look at the programming or look at the algorithm and understand how that targeting decision was made. But this is not a universal standard, right? That's just what the US military does. Other countries right now can come up with their own decisions. There aren't international agreements that are specific to use of artificial intelligence in these. And so some form of cooperation between the United States and its NATO allies could be an area that gets explored by some affirmative cases. You know, the US will also face increased competition in coming years. We're not the only ones who are using AI in some of these systems. Russia and China are thought to be competitors by lots of folks in writing about international relations. And so, you know, there are definitely people who talk about the need for the United States to compete against those countries. They suggest that the US working with allies will make our artificial intelligence more effective. So they suggest that in order to compete on the international arena, our NATO allies need to have systems that we have developed together. They also suggest that we need to have systems that can work together. And you'll hear when we talk about NATO a term called interoperability a lot. Interoperability is just the ability for, you know, US military systems and our allies in NATO's military systems to work together. So, you know, we want our different programs to be able to talk to each other. We want our airplanes to be able to use the same parts when we need to, you know, do maintenance on them, or we want to be able to use, you know, the same sorts of systems. Those are all examples of interoperability. And so there's definitely some literature that exists about the need for the United States and its allies, such as NATO, to work together and cooperate on artificial intelligence in order to come up with the best systems that we can for artificial intelligence. So I've talked at you for a minute. What questions do you have for me about just the artificial intelligence component of the topic? Yes?
Does NATO have any precedent in dealing with AI? Do we know? Like, has NATO done anything? Like, because I did a little reading, I was like, I couldn't find anything where they had, like, made any...
To the best of my knowledge, they do not have a clear, like, AI policy. That does not mean that there hasn't been cooperation on lower level decisions about some of those things. Yeah?
Kind of responding, NATO did develop like a framework for AI and materials and like space cooperation. And they've like set up like research groups for it. Like this is in the last year, and they've actually like done anything material with AI, but they have like a framework for working.
Yeah.
You talk about laws and these like AI controlling weapons. Could AI also be used for like logistics, or does it have other capabilities outside of firing missiles?
Oh yeah. AI can be used for all kinds of things. The question is, does cooperating on that stuff count as security cooperation, right? And so I'm not sure because the term security cooperation has several different definitions, might mean different things in different contexts. And so I could see how doing some form of a military logistics could be a form of security cooperation. Something like confidence building measures with our allies, right, might be a form of security cooperation. I tried to pick some, very broad, big picture stuff, because this is not what we're focusing on for our app. Our affirmative is going to be about cybersecurity, so I wanted to kind of like introduce you to some places where there are big controversies. If I were trying to run away from controversies, exploring stuff like, hey, can we get Alexa to deliver our stuff for our military? I'm joking here. Would be, a tiny little affirmative that you might want to explore. But you would need to find reasons why it needs to happen through NATO and why it would be security cooperation. I thought I saw another hand over here. Yeah?
Sure. So I just wanted to ask you about like, what are some real world like applications of AI that we've seen in the past?
Strong or weak AI?
Strong.
So when you feed all of your pictures to the Facebook algorithm, right, and your mom posts your baby pictures and a picture of you every year on your birthday, which I'm trying to get my mother to stop doing, you are teaching the algorithm how humans' faces age so that they can better identify people in the future, right? AI looks at all of those photos and can be used to identify particular people, which has potential security applications, and in places where, you know, people want to monitor what the population is up to. Feeding the algorithm that sort of data is something that can be a strong application of AI that you actually probably do encounter. Yeah.
I've heard the term AI winters a lot, like when AI development kind of slows down. Based on like what you've read from the RAND Corporation, are we in like a spurt of AI development, or are we kind of slowing down because AI technology?
I don't know. I imagine that the US is always trying to say that it is very competitive and working on the best of the best stuff. There are a bunch of different factors that, you know, feed into whether the United States is being competitive. Those include things like, you know, decisions about whether we are training enough scientists in the United States, whether we have immigration policies that let the best and the brightest specialists come in and work on particular different types of things. You know, and I think that every country has an incentive to say that it's doing a good job in its AI development, but, you know, everything is kind of wacky. There's a pandemic that's been going on. I think that it's definitely something that is being valued, that there are military programs that are working on developing applications of AI, but the exact state of AI-ness is not something that I know off the top of my head or can speak to with any conclusive, you know, authority. I bet you can find sources that say both. Yes?
So like, are there any like groups in NATO dedicated to like AI specifically and like exploring that, or?
I don't know. I think that it's a relatively new technology, and I think that they, you know, we just had somebody talk about a very sort of broad, you know, discussion that they are having in terms of very kind of first steps about policy. NATO is a big organization that has a committee for everything, and so I would bet that there is some committee within NATO that looks at AI, but because this is not what we're going to be debating at this camp, I have not invested as much, you know, time in the specifics of this, because we're going to try to spend most of our time talking about cybersecurity. Yeah?
Do you think most after these like laws bad or laws good on the AI side?
Yes. Like people will do both. The topic doesn't have a direction, right? It just says that we have to cooperate about the thing. It doesn't have to be technology good or emerging technology good or emerging technology bad. If I were writing an app, I would say good AI good, bad AI bad. Does that make sense to folks who have done some stuff? Yeah, I would not be like trying to ban artificial intelligence, right? I'd try to set some good limits that make the United States look like a leader, and like we're working with allies that mean that we can have the effective stuff, but that we can set some parameters that keep killer robots from, you know, going Terminator on all of us. Good AI good, bad AI bad. Other AI questions? All right. So we're going to move on and talk about biotechnology. I actually think that this is the place where the topic has the greatest potential to get weird, because biotechnology is a really, really broad term. You know, there are definitely people who say that biotechnology is anything that uses biology to solve problems and make products. Thanks for the limiting concept, folks on the topic committee. You know, there are other people who say that it uses living cells or living organisms in that process. The term's been around since 1919, and practices that we could consider to be biotechnology are even older than that. For example, once upon a time, people figured out how to use yeast to make bread. They learned how to, you know, store dairy for a long time by using cultures to turn it into cheese, which was a great decision. You know, early selective breeding of animals might be considered very early forms of biotechnology. It's probably not what the topic is meant to be, right? They're not like, hey, work better with France to figure out your cheese situation. You know, that's not something that requires military cooperation. It's not security cooperation, though France might think so. So what areas for cooperation or security cooperation might exist under the umbrella of biotechnology, with the kind of assumption that biotechnology is a big, broad concept that includes a lot of different things. The kind of obvious one, right, is cooperation about bioweapons or bioterrorism. Biological weapons are weapons that use microorganisms and the toxins that they can create to use disease as a weapon, right? People have also been using disease as a weapon for thousands of years, like, you know, medieval, you know, siege situations where they threw dead bodies over walls to try to give people diseases. Bioweapons have been a thing that have existed for a long time. There are international agreements that restrict and suggest that bioweapons are not something that should be used, but it is kind of an ongoing concern about whether states might use bioweapons or that terrorist organizations could deploy bioweapons. And so, you know, the questions like, how are bioweapons detected? What sort of things should NATO be doing to, you know, treat a situation in which bioweapons were used? What should NATO do if a bioweapon happens? What is NATO doing to prevent the acquisition or development of biological weapons by terrorist organizations? These are all potential areas to consider. You know, NATO suggests that these things are all bad. Obviously, no one wants that to happen, right? And they have some existing cooperation, but there are always kind of proposals to tinker at the margins about those sorts of things. And I think that, you know, the pandemic has suggested that we generally are not ready for disease outbreaks, right? We've done a pretty bad job of containing a disease and that has now killed millions of people. And so I bet that there is some pretty decent literature that exists that suggests that, you know, we need better health systems or better preparation for potential use of bioweapons. And so that could be something that NATO cooperates about. A second big area is called forced health protection. Forced health protection is a question of how do we keep our military healthy and safe, ready to perform the tasks that we think that it ought to do. You know, what vaccines have we developed to help keep our military safe? There are some proposals in the US that are even like looking at our microbiomes to develop probiotics to give to soldiers who are deployed overseas so that they're more militarily ready. There have been, you know, for a long time, suggestions that we can use biology to make our military forces healthier, more successful. You know, we're going to play the science fiction game a little bit again because that's the thing that happens when you talk about emerging technologies, but potential super soldiers is another wild out there version of what forced health protection might look like, and militaries have tried for a long time to use biology to create better or you know, or super soldiers, people who can stay awake longer, so that they can, you know, fight in longer forms of combat or fly longer air missions. It's like one example of a real application of what, you know, how that has happened in the past. So, you know, I don't think that anybody's going to read the, like, give all the, you know, military forces in NATO vitamins type affirmative, but that's my nightmare for what a biotech security cooperation looks like. We should all make sure that everyone in the NATO military forces gets the same yogurt so that they don't have upset tummies, right? Would be an example of the way that you could use biotechnology if you can find the NATO key card and the security cooperation card, is like the nightmare version of what the topic could be and why I'm not super crazy about a broad term like biotechnology being in here.
Sorry. I did my best.
I don't personally blame Lauren. Other potential options. Biotechnology has extensive environmental applications as well. You know, there are a lot of industries that use things that are considered biotechnology to make the planet a healthier and happier place to live. It's used in things like making biofuels that can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I could see the potential world if you found the right set of cards, an affirmative that says that NATO should switch to a particular type of biofuel that relies on biotechnology to, you know, help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and or make its supplies safer from things like price shocks, right, or the need to deliver oil. You can also use biotechnology to do things to like clean up past contamination from military military engagements. I think that it's not a place where I've spent a ton of time because it's, again, not what we are doing with at this camp, but I think that there are definitely people who write about biotechnology's applications to the environment. The military's need to have, be greener, and that if you happen to cobble together the right set of cards, the broadness of the biotech stuff means that there are potential environmental applications there. And last but not least, like, there are going to be people who say we need to cooperate on all of the things, right? Just like the United States needs to keep up with its adversaries in artificial intelligence. There are people who are going to write the same kind of ideas about biotechnology and its application to these different areas. And so kind of a never-ending theme there. Questions about biotech?
Because I'm thinking of vaccines.
Yeah.
I think that's applicable to security operation.
Yeah. If you're in the U.S. military, you have to get vaccinated against smallpox. They're like the only people in the U.S. who have that vaccine.
Even like, just like, did you not just do like a general? Do you think it have to be a military application to be under security cooperation?
Great question. I don't know. I mean, like, I think that you could. I think that there's the question of like, is this thing security, right? And is it cooperation if the United States works with NATO on that particular thing? I think that there would probably be people who would potentially, if you find the cards, right, who would suggest that that's within the realm of plausibly security cooperation. I don't think that the term is so specific that, like, stockpiling vaccines as biodefense definitely sounds like security cooperation as like my gut check level. Making sure that our population is resilient against potential bioweapons makes a lot of sense. If we're talking about like make everyone get the flu vaccine, maybe not so much, but I definitely think that depending on what you're doing with the vaccines and how you're using them, it's potentially something that could be security cooperation. Yeah.
Do you think some variation on like fuel, like would that be security cooperation? Some sort of like encourage biofuel like production kind of deal?
Set standards for NATO tanks on biofuel use, right? Or the United States should engage in security cooperation with its NATO allies to come up with more effective biofuels for military applications. Sounds plausible, right? I don't know that the cards exist, but it would be something that I'd be interested in looking at, and I know that literature exists on the environmental standards used by NATO. Like, there's a book called Greening the Alliance that is all about environmental policies that NATO has. And like most of our European allies, tend to be more interested in reducing greenhouse gas emissions than the US is, so I bet that people would be interested in that cooperation generally. You had a question up here?
Oh, yeah. So like, could you have like some sort of like mix between like biotech and AI with like super soldiers with like chips in them?
Yeah, there's definitely overlap in all of these things, right? Biotech and AI work together in a decent number of places. Just because I'm kind of discussing them separately does not mean that there aren't, all kinds of situations in which those things work together. Likewise, AI probably needs some cybersecurity. We don't only not want the Terminator, but we don't want the Terminator to get hacked. So definitely a decent amount of overlap between all of these things. Great question. Yeah.
You mentioned treaties state that you can't really develop bioweapons. NATO, what if some of the countries in NATO don't follow like treaties that other countries do? Who decides does NATO as a whole decide we're going to abide by the treaty and not develop bioweapons, even if members of the organization are like, they haven't signed that treaty yet, or how does that work?
So the CBW has been around for a long time, and almost everyone is a party to that already. There are places where like there's disagreement among NATO members about using some weapons of mass destruction. It's usually the United States who is the one leading the iffier parts under international law in that world. Like the United States hosts some of its tactical nuclear weapons in countries like Turkey, which is questionable under the non-proliferation treaty, right? So it's often the United States who is kind of pushing for more military capability, and other allies, particularly smaller allies in the alliance, who are more interested in abiding by international law. And that has to do with some differences in, what their values are and what they think effective participation in the international system looks like, which if you're really interested in that question, I'm giving an elective on international relations theory tomorrow, which we'll talk about that stuff. So the question is like, I don't think that most of the other NATO members are pushing for the, NATO to use or deploy bioweapons. I think that all NATO members are concerned about the use of bioweapons, and that most of the controversy would be around how to respond or prevent an attack, rather than like building more. Yeah.
Okay, so like, would bioterrorists be legally seen the same way that like terrorists are, like someone who just like bombed a city versus someone who like made the bird flu airborne?
So, I mean, those people would both be considered terrorists, right? And that I bet lots of countries would do whatever they could to stop them from carrying out attacks, and if they had carried out attacks, either retaliate or punish those particular individuals for those actions. Like terrorism is the use of violence and fear for like a political message, and it's not done by states, right? And so whether, it's somebody using conventional weapons or bioweapons, most states are not a big fan of those decisions because it kills people, it makes them scared, it kind of interferes with the state's ability to do stuff that they want to do. But they might be extra concerned about bioweapons, chemical weapons, particularly because it's really hard to control a biological weapon, right? Like, you can't say some people will get sick and others won't, and so it has the potential to really spread and have wide-scale consequences. You had a question?
Yeah, would you say that, like, making sure that Europe is secure from, like, invasion, like, I'm thinking, like, is, like, a food scarcity, like, we need biotechnology to protect, like, food scarcity in Europe. Do you think that'd be applicable?
Yeah. So the question is that security cooperation? But,
yeah.
Food development and food stuff is definitely in the world of biotech. Can we genetically engineer this thing so that it's safe from the use of diseases that affect crops, which is also a form of a bioweapon, right? It was a question. The issue that I would want to look at there is like, how do I make that security cooperation rather than just like food is good and genetically engineering is good or bad for food. Yes?
Would some variation on like make anthrax harder for terrorists to get the like hospital this year? Potentially, if you can find a reason why NATO needs to do it, right? The big question for a lot of the really out there stuff is, why does NATO need to be the one taking the action? And is this like security cooperation from the United States? Like, I bet every state does not want, terrorists to get anthrax and is probably doing something about that. But if you can find like a solvency advocate who suggests that more cooperation needs to occur through NATO, it's potentially a thing. All right, biotech, it's big, but you got to find NATO reasons. Okay, so cybersecurity is the thing that you will be debating about during the course of this camp. I think that this will be kind of the default affirmative that most camps produce, some sort of affirmative that talks about NATO's policies regarding cybersecurity. You will also, in your labs, either today or tomorrow, get access to the affirmative case in the 1AC, and so you'll have the evidence that we have to support this particular affirmative. So if there's something that you want to know more about, you'll have plenty of time to kind of talk about both sides of this affirmative case in your lab with your lab leaders to read through the evidence, and you'll get a supporting set of evidence for kind of both sides here. The essential question of this area is, how should NATO/NATO member states prevent and/or respond to a cyber attack? Right? How can NATO prevent cyber attacks? And if cyber attacks occur, how should they respond to those attacks? Cyber attacks can do a lot of different types of harm, right? They can target military systems and mess up targeting. I made a joke about like hacked terminators, but if you are talking about military guidance systems, that can be really unpleasant. If you could spoof incoming missiles, you could cause a lot of countries to risk retaliation to a strike that's not happening. They can also undermine, civilian systems like the electrical grid, like your ability to get clean water, other essential infrastructure like that. It can target banks and financial services to undermine sanctions.
they can spread disinformation and voting systems in order to undermine democracy in the United States and abroad. In fact, that's an area in which cyber attacks have happened and affect NATO. So, in 2014, Russia is believed to have sought to undermine an election in Ukraine by tinkering with their voting. There are also cyber attacks on the NATO member Estonia in 2014, and that kind of required NATO to think more carefully about what its cybersecurity policies ought to be. In 2008, Russia conducted significant cyber attacks that preceded its invasion of portions of Georgia the country, not Georgia the state. Don't worry, you're all physically safe here in Georgia. But NATO's current policy is essentially, if I kind of wrapped it up in one sentence, to respond on a case-by-case basis, right? It hasn't set a clear red line for where Russia doing something would be kind of across the line, where it would require a really severe retaliation. It hasn't specified what that retaliation might look like. And so the area of cybersecurity is one where NATO does talk about its cybersecurity policies. It does have forms of cooperation, but I think that there are definitely situations where clarifying that policy will be a place where most affirmatives will focus. So right now, NATO's policy is essentially one of what we call strategic ambiguity, right? Strategic ambiguity means that for strategic reasons, they have not specified what their response might be, what their red lines might be. They have deliberately kept those things ambiguous so that they have flexibility in the question of whether they should respond or how they should respond should a cyber attack occur. Most of these affirmatives that I think that you'll see will reduce strategic ambiguity and make an argument that clear standards are actually more effective at preventing cyber attacks from occurring, either by improving defensive or offensive systems. So some affirmatives might focus on NATO cooperation for cyber defense. Making NATO countries less susceptible to cyber attacks is the kind of idea behind those affirmatives. NATO might work together to protect critical infrastructure. It might set standards for how they detect whether cyber attacks have occurred. They might improve information sharing. All of those things are things that kind of happen to some degree in NATO now, but if you found solvency advocates who suggested improving cooperation on a defensive strategy, those could be affirmative cases. Others will talk about offense. This is the concept of deterrence. Some of you have debated a couple of different topics. Could any of you explain what the concept of deterrence is, or what deterrence means? Yeah.
Try to, without force, try to convince the other person not to attack you because your retaliation would be so costly that it would make any attack themselves.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation, right? Deterrence is the idea that you stop someone from doing something that you don't want them to do by making it really costly for them to do so, right? Like you make sure that there are consequences if they carry out that particular policy. So this is something that we use in our real life, like if I don't do my homework, I'm going to get grounded. Might be my mom trying to deter me from not doing my homework by saying that there would be severe consequences for disobeying the rules, right? Is a kind of practical example of deterrence. In nuclear weapons, we have the concept of deterrence, right, and mutually assured destruction, that two nuclear states wouldn't attack each other because they know that the other state would respond with nuclear weapons, and that would be really bad for the first state that started stuff, right? People believe that has worked relatively well. An offensive kind of cyber operations, an offensive posture is one that would apply the concept of deterrence to cyberspace. This is the idea that we would stop cyber attacks by making sure that potential attackers know that there would be a serious and severe response if cyber attacks were to occur in the future. So these apps might clarify what's the red line. You know, you might be able to mess with some little things, but there's a point at which NATO member states would consider this an attack on the alliance or on a member state. What types of actions would result in a severe offensive response? We also might clarify what sort of responses could happen either in the cyber or physical world if one of those happened to occur. And that's the kind of basic premise of your affirmative, right? Your affirmative says that NATO, that you'll read at camp, says that NATO should clarify its policy regarding cyber attacks and what cyber attacks constitute an attack on a member state. So I'm going to put a pin in that concept because we're going to talk a little bit about how NATO functions in just a moment. But does anybody have any questions about the cyber stuff in a very kind of broad way? Yes?
Not in a broad way, but you just said the app was NATO should clarify what it should do against cybersecurity.
What sort of cyber attacks it would consider like an attack that triggers something called Article 5 in NATO, which we'll talk about in just a second.
Doesn't that also reduce strategic ambiguity?
It does, yes. I think that most affirmatives that work in this world are going to do something that reduces strategic ambiguity. And the negative response is going to be strategic ambiguity is good. Yes?
I know for the app, we have the fiat for the US. Will fiat also be applicable to NATO?
I think not, right? Like, the United States can increase its cooperation, but the agent of the resolution is not the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so one of the things that you're going to have to do to write a good app is to prove that NATO will say yes. And we'll talk about why that's tricky in just a minute. I love NATO. Yeah?
Could you give some examples of cyber attacks that weren't from Russia?
So North Korea is also thought to have engaged in extensive cyber attacks against the West. The United States and Israel have employed cyber attacks against Iran when it was enriching uranium and was able to kind of destroy some centrifuges there by making them spin too fast because computer stuff. So the United States has engaged in cyber attacks on other countries as well. It's not like Russia is the only one. The reason I pinpoint Russia is that they are historically, you know, the adversary of NATO, or the reason that NATO exists. And so you're most likely to find NATO key cards about that, but I bet that there are cards that exist about other potential, you know, countries conducting cyber attacks against NATO member states. It's not just that, but I'm using Russia-specific examples just because I know that those exist and are a robust area of the NATO literature. Yes?
So when when the U.S. conducts like attacks against Iran, aren't those not retaliatory or like deterrence in a sense? Because
yeah, that's not us trying to protect our cybersecurity in that particular instance, right? That was the United States and Israel trying to keep Iran from having the material that it needs in order to develop nuclear weapons. And so it was thought, you know, these countries think that that is a justified decision to conduct a cyber attack in order to, you know, prevent development of nuclear weapons, which are against a variety of international laws. And that the alternatives would be worse, right? Like, if you can stop a centrifuge from working from thousands of miles away without having to do airstrikes or anything like that, that might be a preferable choice. But I would not consider that to be, you know, cybersecurity by the United States. The question is, like, what was Iran's cybersecurity to prevent attacks like that from happening? And I think other countries have, you know, looked at the code that was used there and have improved their cyber attacks in the years since that occurred. And so there are more and more sophisticated cyber attacks that happen all the time. I saw him back here.
Well, just out of curiosity, since you pinpointed Russia.
Yeah.
So have you had this plan, or like, if we had the insecurity, like when Russia attacked our gas lines, like what is that cooperation, like in that security, what would that have done for that? Like, how would that have prevented it, or like even shortened like the amount of time that we had our gas lines?
So the question, right, is you know, what would have happened if these things existed? The idea is that the attacks wouldn't happen because it's clear that the United States and its NATO buddies would be really mean in response. So, you know, Russia might be risking a military confrontation with the United States, France, Britain, all of the 30 NATO members if it conducts cyber attacks like that. And so if the idea of deterrence works, right, they might think twice about doing things like that. If they know where the red line is and they know, okay, attacking gas systems or attacking voting machines is across the red line, then, you know, they are less likely to conduct those types of attacks because they know what the response will be. Whereas they think maybe we can get away with this because it's not that big of a deal right now, or that NATO hasn't agreed and they'll have to come to consensus on what the reply ought to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just feel like historically, since Russia's been like one of the main like sources of attack answer because that's like kind of what they're fighting. But like, I feel like that's like historically, since like I said, they are the ones to like kind of initiate these attacks. What's going to stop them still like now? Like if they've been doing it for so long and they have a strong military, what's going to stop them?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a negative argument to say that this would not work, right? There is disagreement about cybersecurity experts and like security experts about what an effective response ought to look like. And so strategic ambiguity, good, bad, nothing can stop them. Can we figure out who actually did the attack, right, is a question called attribution. Can we attribute this attack to a particular state? One of the techniques that Russia has done when talking about, I gave those examples about Georgia and Estonia, they've said, oh, that's not us. There might be people in Russia who are doing that, but it's not our government that's doing that, right? And so there are questions there about whether you can control what states do in regards to cybersecurity in some of those ways. And so those are all like negative arguments that I think exists in the negative packet for case debating. Yeah.
I have like two questions.
Sure.
Would some variation on like trained U.S. hackers be topical?
I don't know why NATO has to do that.
Okay. And then the second question I had to ask was like, do you think like Portugal actually like send troops to invade Russia, like because like Poland like got the electric grid got taken?
Great question. The countries that might play spoiler to any affirmative are things that we'll talk about in a minute. Whether NATO can come to a consensus is an important question for every affirmative because you have to get countries to cooperate, and the way that NATO is set up, countries have to agree. One of the other things is that when NATO decides to respond, and we'll talk about this in a minute, there is flexibility in what some of the articles of the treaty require or allow in terms of that response, and that response can be proportional to the abilities of different countries. So if one particular country doesn't have as good hackers or doesn't have the military capabilities, they might be able to contribute in other ways, and that response does not necessarily have to be troops and bombs and all of the same things that you might expect from some of the larger NATO member states. You in the red hat, we had your hand up first, and then the guy next to you I had to specify, because you're right.
So does NATO have, I think NATO does have a cyber command, but is it like how staffed or funded is it?
I cannot answer that question off the top of my head. I think that it's something that NATO has been paying a lot more attention to since 2014, and I think that it's definitely something that I think the best ops are the ones that kind of center around this, like, what is an attack and what should the response be? But I imagine that you can find sort of broad generic, we should just have more resources type of claims there, and that might be more focused on the defensive element. Yes?
So like you said before, like a lot of the times countries claim like it was independent actors within their borders. What are the like current rules surrounding like those countries taking responsibility for like the independent actions of citizens?
I am not 100% sure, right? And you could make an argument, as the United States and many NATO state members have, that these actions by Russia in these particular instances were under the guidance of the state, right? They're ordered by the state. These are operatives of their intelligence units, that sort of thing. The KGB is coming for you. Not that there is a KGB anymore. But that sort of idea, right? So the question of how do we attribute attacks is something that is a debate in the cybersecurity literature that I cannot, in the course of our 2 hours, completely sum up for you, but that is a question that like cybersecurity experts wrestle with on a regular basis, and the folks who talk about the importance of cybersecurity in international relations also debate about extensively. Yes?
So like, if the US has been like the cyber attacker, what's their incentive for enforcing cybersecurity policy?
That's a great question. There are times where the United States government has been aware of some vulnerabilities in software and thought that the benefits that it gains from maintaining those vulnerabilities in order to conduct its own operations outweigh the disadvantages of closing some of those vulnerabilities and making people who run the software kind of aware of things like backdoors and 0 days. For a long time, the US was the largest purchaser of 0 days, and that market has become more complicated as more countries get involved in that. And so that might be a place where cooperation might occur in the kind of defensive realm rather than the offensive realm. But if the United States thought that the risk to our own population, to our allies, was greater than the benefit that we have from maintaining vulnerabilities so that we can conduct cyber operations, that might be something that, we also have fiat, right? Like we can just decide that this is what the US wants, but we have to get it through NATO. So I don't think that a policy that just says like the US will unilaterally change its position on cyber attacks would be something that would be viable, but definitely something that we can kind of make the United States take a particular position to NATO, propose it as a part of its security cooperation. Cam? Nope. Got it? Okay. So let's talk about NATO. And here's the place where you risk getting me into some really random history rants. So if that happens, sorry, but also not that sorry. So NATO is a political and military alliance that was founded in 1949. It currently has 30 members. The political part of the alliance is that NATO members all have to be democracies, and at the time of joining the organization had to have met certain democracy standards. What was going on in the world in 1949? Yeah. Start of the Cold War. Yeah.
World War II had just ended.
World War II had just ended. What is the Cold War? Yeah.
The ideological struggle between the democratic capitalists like West, kind of led by the US and Britain, and then like communist Soviet Union that kind of controlled Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I saw your hand. Did you have more to add?
No, that was pretty much it. But I guess part of that was like the proxy wars, like Vietnam.
Yeah. So, yes.
It's built on the Truman Doctrine that says like the United States have every responsibility to destroy a communism regime in other countries.
Yeah, it sounds like you're up on your history here. Yeah.
Yeah, it was also to stop the spread of Russia, as Russia after World War II had taken control and puppeted most of the governments, which it had ran through during World War II.
Yeah. So, yes.
I believe Russia also had like atomic bombs, like they just created these atomic bombs.
Yeah, it's right around that time. They're behind the United States in terms of developing the atomic bombs. Yeah.
Yeah, and then also like over time, like the alliance has become like different, I guess. Like originally it was more of a defense treaty against Russia, and now it's more of like how does the U.S. project power into places like the Middle East.
Interesting observation about NATO and how it has changed over time. Yeah.
I guess we would say that usually in the Cold War is in the arms race that I guess kind of fizzled out at the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. The end of the Cold War is thought to happen early 90s, 1991-ish. The Soviet Union falls apart. If you're a big Ronald Reagan fan, you might think that he has a lot to do with that. If you're not a big Ronald Reagan fan, you probably think some economic policies in the Soviet Union and some bad choices had a lot to do with that. Okay, the Cold War, right, it happens after the end of World War II. In World War II, there are 4 major countries that are allies, right? The United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. We now refer to the Soviet Union as Russia, but Russia is just one of the states that makes up the overall Soviet Union. Those 4 countries are fighting against the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and some others. Germany has invaded most of Europe, right? They have invaded Poland, which ticked off the Soviet Union. They had previously made an agreement about how they might both mess with Poland. And large parts of Eastern and Western Europe have kind of fallen under Germany's control during World War II. We all know that the Allies won that conflict, and most of the countries that were liberated from Nazi Germany by the Soviet Union during that period were rebuilt by the Soviet Union with communism as their economic system, and they tended to have more totalitarian governments like the Soviet Union did. And so NATO, when it's formed in 1949 by the parts of Europe that are liberated by the United States, Great Britain, and or France, and are territories that are tried to be rebuilt by those countries to the extent possible, tend to have democratic and capitalist political and economic systems at that time. And so NATO is an organization that attempts to form an alliance among those Western European powers that are after World War II are taken over or liberated by the United States, France, and Great Britain. Those countries and the original members are, mostly Western Europe and or the North Atlantic, so like Canada's part of that, even though they're not in Europe. The United States is not in Europe. But so you have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Soviet Union also has a bunch of allies, right? Not only are there several countries, not just Russia, that are part of the Soviet Union prior to that point, but they also formed the Warsaw Pact among the countries that they have liberated and that have adopted communism as their economic system. And so one of the reasons why NATO is a political alliance is that it requires democratic standards for the countries that want to join it, right? And so it's a union of democracies. It's also a defense and a military alliance, right? It says that the members of these NATO member states will contribute to the collective security of the alliance as a whole. NATO now sets some standards about how much you need to spend on your military to make sure that there aren't countries that are overly freeloading on the United States. So, kind of early on, there were countries in Western Europe whose economies had, been pretty wrecked because they had just been invaded and gone through a war. So early on, there's a lot of that spending coming from the United States. But there is some expectation that every country that is a member of NATO is able to contribute to the collective security. And so its original goal, right, is to counter Russia throughout the Cold War, to balance against the Warsaw Pact, and you see a map here of people who have later joined NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is founded by what's called the Washington Treaty. So this is the actual treaty that people signed when they joined NATO back in the 40s or later. There are lots of things in that treaty, but the things that I think that you need to be kind of most aware of are a couple particular articles, because you will hear people discuss Article 5 or Article 4 on a regular basis, and you might be in a position where the people you're debating against or your partner will assume that you know what those things are. So Article 5 is probably the most famous part of the Washington Treaty. It is the one that says that collective defense. The idea behind Article 5 is that an attack on one NATO member state will be treated as an attack on all. There are some limitations that are spelled out in the treaty about where that attack occurs, like it has to happen in the North Atlantic area of the territories of the member states or on their militaries that are operating legally in places like the Atlantic Ocean. But for the most part, an attack on one NATO member state is treated as an attack on all. The response that NATO deems appropriate, is one that is open to some flexibility, right? If Article 5 is invoked by one of the members of NATO and they say, oh gosh, Russia has invaded me, right? There is some, NATO can deem different types of responses appropriate. That does not necessarily have to be a military response. So, if a NATO member were invaded by Russia, it's possible that that response might be something like military sanctions or diplomatic actions against that particular country. It might be contributing supplies to, military troops from another country, but not necessarily engaging in the military forces yourself. So the Article 5 is not specific about what type of response is required if an attack on one of its members happens, but it does say that all of the members of NATO will come to the defense of the other members in the case in which they had been attacked. Article 5 has been invoked exactly once. Can anybody tell me when that was?
9/11.
Right after 9/11, right? So the only time where this has been used was the United States saying that the terrorist attacks on 9/11 were an attack on one of its members that got several other NATO member states to support military actions in Afghanistan, and that's in an era where Russia wasn't so scary to the US anymore. They started doing things outside of their traditional area of operations, in the North Atlantic area. And so it's a little bit ironic that the only time that, this core founding, most famous part of this treaty has ever been used basically had nothing to do with Russia. So the other part that is useful and thing that you ought to know is Article 4. And this does also get talked about in some of the cybersecurity literature. Article 4 says that parties will consult with each other whenever their security is threatened. So all of the parties in NATO will consult with each other whenever their security is threatened. It does not require that an attack has actually occurred. It does not require a particular type of response, right? But that the countries in NATO should all work together. If, a cyber attack occurred, they should consult about what sort of response is appropriate. If they thought that one of the member countries were being threatened, they should work together to come up with solutions. And this is kind of what NATO means when they say that they respond to cyber attacks on a case-by-case basis, right? They can consult and use Article 4 if a cyber attack occurs on a NATO member state, and that they don't necessarily have to treat that as an Article 5 situation, but that they can use their consultation process to come up with an appropriate response based upon that situation. The affirmative that you all will be reading will say that we should clarify situations in which cyber attacks become Article 5 issues of the North Atlantic Treaty, right? That we should figure out which situations in which NATO should deem a cyber attack as an attack on one and invoke that collective security agreement in the Washington Treaty. The last kind of important thing that you should know about how NATO works in the Washington Treaty is that NATO is a consensus-based organization. And somebody asked a question about this earlier. But NATO basically doesn't do anything unless all of the members can come to an agreement, right? All of the members of NATO have to vote yes. Any particular member can vote no, and it essentially works as a veto. They can block new policies for the organization. They can block new members from joining the organization. So that consensus process, that consultation process requires universal agreement among NATO members, which can make different types of new policy changes really complicated and hard to do. And that's a potential stumbling block that affirmatives might face just based upon the nature of trying to cooperate with NATO. Yes?
Doesn't NATO have a rule that they can, like one country can agree to disagree, but it can still be passed through for the other nations?
Countries can always abstain, right? But if the United States wanted to vote no, it can block NATO from doing anything, basically, right? If somebody wants to say an active no, they can stop all kinds of effective NATO policies. Yes?
So basically it creates 30 unique voters that can all have different issues that would be able to block any.
Yep. Fun stuff. Yes?
You mentioned that Article 5 is limited, like invoking Article 5 is limited to when an attack occurs in the North Atlantic area. For cyberspace, would that mean that the cyber attack has to affect something or someone in the North Atlantic area?
That's a great question. You might be clarifying what it means, where a cyber attack is, right? Like that is a question that is currently ambiguous. The treaty text says that things that happen in the southern hemisphere are not protected under the treaty. So the question of where is cyberspace, where did the attack occur, is an ambiguous question that is one of the reasons why right now it's not an auto Article 5 question, but one that if NATO came to a consensus about what they mean, might be one of the things that happens in the process of determining that something does invoke Article 5. Yes?
If Poland invokes Article 5,
yes,
and then Hungary decides it doesn't want to declare war on Russia, but every other country wants to, could every other country declare war on Russia under the treaty, or no?
So Article 5 is a collective defense, one where we decide that an attack on one is an attack on all. I imagine that if Poland attempted to invoke Article 5 and we had agreed on what an Article 5 violation is and someone is clearly a NATO member, I bet the rest of the organization would probably still come to that country's defense even if somebody kind of slow-rolled it. And part of that, right, is that there isn't a particular response that's required. So Hungary might be like, we said that was me and that's our Article 5 response. And we don't need to send troops or we don't need to retaliate in the same way. And so that ambiguity in what the response needs to be is something that can attempt to accommodate those differences. in those situations. Otherwise, you know, if there's a disagreement, they would be talking about this being an Article 4 kind of situation. There have been times where, like, Turkey has suggested that if it got into a shooting conflict in Syria, that could be a situation in which they would invoke Article 5. That happens to be outside of the territory of any of the NATO member states, and so typically one would think that that is not an Article 5 situation, but would be an Article 4 situation because they deem that the treaty text and how Article 5 is supposed to apply does not work there. You know, Turkey did not like that kind of response, but there have been situations in which there's been discussion about whether Article 5 might be invoked and, you know, what their appropriate response might be. Yes?
So as a hegemon, do you think like the U.S. has enough influence to change countries' minds when it comes to votes? Or like could you argue that because the U.S. wants to do something, they'll convince other states to vote in their favor?
Great question. I don't know. That's an evidence question, right? I think that the United States has a good bit of influence within NATO. These are countries that have typically wanted to be our ally, but that, you know, more recent developments suggest that not every NATO member is willing to fall in line the way that they might have, you know, 30 years ago. And so I think that we'll get to a moment where we're going to talk about some important people and countries. There are situations in which that's a debatable solvency question. Yes?
Okay, so in the UN, there are smaller organizations like the Security Council that give some countries more power than others. Is it like that in NATO, or is every country equal?
Every country's equal. Everybody gets to veto. Everyone's on the Security Council. Great question. Yes?
So since they only act when things happen in the northern hemisphere, if one of the countries has a territory in the southern hemisphere, what happens? Like if it's attacked or something?
They might still ask their allies to help them out, but it would not necessarily invoke Article 5.
Okay.
If they like had territories that are outside of the geographic scope of the treaty. Yes?
Alright, 2 questions.
Yeah.
So the first one is like, so like, an Article 5 response, would that just be like an easy way into like a third world war? Because if it's like one for all, or like and then my second question is that like, what if like 2 countries that are both in NATO like start keeping each other? Like what if they have like
So past NATO members have had beef. Greece and Turkey don't like each other very much. They have disagreements over an island called Cyprus in the Mediterranean. And even like a year or 2 ago, they were having disagreements about the rates to like natural gas and stuff that are affected by where you think the borders on Cyprus between Greek Cyprus and Turkish Cyprus are. Big mess. And so like those countries have like fought with each other. There are parts of the NATO treaty that suggest that member states should try to work out their differences peacefully. And so that's kind of a different question. And I'm not sure that NATO would necessarily side one way or another unless they were an obvious aggressor. So like if one country for no reason invaded another and there were an obvious aggressor, I imagine the organization would side with the country that was not the aggressor. There are also some like stipulations about how the UN has to approve things, but it's complicated. But there's like some recent historical disagreements that have brought some of those questions. Like, does this just cause World War III is one of those concerns for like what happens if deterrence fails, right? The idea of deterrence is we make the response so big and bad that we stop conflict from happening in the first place. If you think that deterrence is effective, you know, World War III doesn't happen, those kind of first steps that would start us down that path don't happen. If you think that deterrence is an ineffective strategy, you say that this just risks escalation, right? Instead of one piddly little cyber attack on a bank in the United States, we now have a shooting war with Russia. That sounds like a really bad situation that could get out of hand really quickly. That involves all of these countries in Europe, right? And so that's the question about whether, you know, you think deterrence is an effective strategy. It's something that gets debated in international relations pretty regularly. Yes?
Could a member leave NATO if they disagree with the position?
Members may leave NATO. It is questionable whether a member can be kicked out of NATO, but countries can definitely leave. The way that you leave NATO is by submitting articles of denunciation to the United States, which is weird if the United States were the one who would want to leave. And then you're still bound by the terms of the treaty for like 18 months or so. So it's not like immediately I'm out, I'm not going to play. And it has an extended period for that reason. They don't want somebody to be like, ooh, we started a war, bye. But if a country is like, I don't want to do this anymore, they are allowed to leave. And there are people who write about whether some current NATO member states ought to leave on their own accord. Some have at times threatened to leave on their own accord. And then there is a question about whether some states that may not be meeting their treaty obligations could be kicked out. Yes?
So like what kind of circumstances would have to happen for a country to get kicked out of NATO?
I'm not sure that it's legally allowed. That's a question mark. But NATO does have standards about how much a country is supposed to spend on its military. Very few countries actually meet that standard. It does have some standards about being a democracy in order to join, but it's not clear that you have to keep up that level of democracy in order to stay in the organization. And so there is not a clear standard for kicking someone out. That is a debate that exists in the literature as to whether that's possible and also whether that would be a good idea. Yes?
How do Western countries that are not in NATO, like Australia or New Zealand, like cooperate with NATO, or do they mostly just cooperate with like individual countries?
They tend to have cooperation with many of the other NATO member states but are not NATO members. And so there are things like Five Eyes, which is an intelligence sharing service that exists between largely English-speaking countries. Australia and New Zealand tend to have either bilateral or multilateral agreements with other countries that the United States is an ally with and are party to other alliances, but they are not members of NATO. They tend to share a decent number of values and goals of NATO, but they are not in the North Atlantic area. Yes?
In a debate, will we have to see out that every country says yes to a policy or no?
I'm not sure that you can. The United States federal government should increase its security cooperation with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in one of the areas. I'm not sure that, I think that if you wanted to say that you could fiat all of the countries say yes, that it would say the North Atlantic Treaty Organization should cooperate on the thing. I think that you can fiat that the United States proposes something and that you can make solvency arguments about the likelihood that that would be adopted or get through the consensus process. It might mean that affirmatives get to be a little bit vague about what happens or what those exact standards are. Like I could see saying, yeah, we should clarify what Article 5 is. The United States should definitely propose that we set some red lines. They should be approximately here, but the exact thing is something that gets worked out in the consensus process in NATO, and that we can't fiat exactly what that is because of how this process works. But we fiat the initiation, we fiat the goal. The proposal looks basically like this, and we have like solvency advocates who say that's a good idea, I think is a defensible way of approaching the affirmative. Yes?
Would some variation of like political capital, like the US is going to kick out Poland now, Poland kick out good, or something like that, but like it costs political capital to kick Poland out, would that be like a viable dissent on this topic? Or?
Oh wow, okay. The dissents on this topic are a little complicated. The ones that we will have are, one is about how international law works, and your labs will talk about that. It's about clarifying what is an armed conflict, and that, by having this clarification about cyber attacks, it kind of messes with current understandings for what armed conflicts are and that being bad. I think that when you get to counterplan time, counterplan the United States should withdraw from NATO, NATO bad, is certainly competitive with affirmatives that increase cooperation with NATO, and is something that could be done. I'm not sure that it's even possible to kick a country out of NATO, and it would certainly require consensus of members and some kind of legal maneuvering. I'm not sure that the cooperating about security stuff would necessarily get us there. I guess it would be possible to say that everyone would get so fed up with a particular member state blocking something that the affirmative is kind of the last straw for that sort of thing. But I don't know that that evidence exists, given that the countries that play spoiler tend to play spoiler about a lot of things. And I'm not sure that the kind of link evidence exists there, but it's not impossible. And it wouldn't be Poland, it would be Turkey. Or maybe Hungary. They want to keep Poland in. Yeah.
Do we have, do you know any other like organizations that are, could be used like CP out of NATO?
So you could counterplan out of using NATO by the United States just doing the thing. You could counterplan by working with any of the NATO member states on a bilateral basis, right? Rather than through the NATO organization. The United States and Great Britain, the United States and all 30 of those member states could just like work together on something like the defensive strategies, right? This is part of why I think this affirmative is good. It has a really strong NATO key warrant based upon the use of Article 5. And that's the reason that we wrote it. But you could propose something to the United Nations to deal with lethal autonomous weapons. You could propose just a multilateral treaty that any country that wants to could join it. There are a bunch of different international organizations that could be potential counterplan areas. And one of the counterplans that we have is, do other international law stuff. Yes?
How does NATO cooperate with the European Union and other European defense organizations?
So there's some overlap in concept between NATO and the European Union and various European defense organizations.
Le jazz, c'est pour le corps.
Yes, there is some interaction between those ideas that when you talk about the kind of international law disad, you'll hear about. And that's interaction is about the United Nations Article 51 that explains what an armed conflict is. NATO in the Washington Treaty says that it's not supposed to do stuff that violates Article 51. They're not supposed to violate the premise of the United Nations. They're not supposed to go starting stuff, right? Those sorts of ideas. And so if NATO were to clarify what a conflict is in a way that is inconsistent with what the United Nations thinks a conflict is, that would be messy. But we'll get to that one more on DISAD Day. All right, this is awesome. Let's talk a little bit more about, I'm gonna skip some of this stuff because it would be me giving you weird history lessons. We can circle back to this if you're interested, and why does Russia care about some of that stuff. But let's talk about people you should know. So, we've mostly had really pretty slides here. Now we've got some grumpy looking folks on our screen. The first guy here is Vladimir Putin. Can anybody tell me who he is? Yeah. He's the president of Russia. Vladimir Putin is the current president of Russia. He's on his 4th term as president. He's held political leadership in a variety of important roles since 1999 in Russia. Yes?
I was going to say also, isn't he basically a dictator off the name?
He is definitely somebody who has moved Russia away from democratization efforts. He's somebody who has a reputation for silencing or attempting to silence political dissidents, possibly including, attempting to have them killed when they're abroad, which is not great. He is a former member of the KGB, and overall his administration is associated with some corruption, some concentration of power among elites and oligarchs. The United States is not super fond of this guy right now. So, people you should know include Vladimir Putin. Why do we care about him? Yeah.
He's kind of like a chief enemy of NATO right now. He's actively invading a NATO prospect member, and threatening to nuke NATO.
Yeah, so I guess we should go back here, right? Why does Russia care? That includes stuff like there is, historic tension between NATO, which was founded to counter the Warsaw Pact and what the Soviet Union was doing. For a long time, the purpose of that organization was to, keep Russia out. And so, Russia has had a lot of concerns about NATO increasing its activity, increasing its mission, trying to act in different areas because of those historic Cold War tensions. So, right now, Russia is engaged in a conflict in Ukraine. Ukraine is a country that has at times considered and taken some steps in the general direction of NATO membership. Remember that to join NATO, a country has to demonstrate that it's met certain democratic standards. It has to meet certain military spending standards. And then there is a formal process that a country has to go through where they work towards membership and eventually are voted on by all members of the organization. There is a bit of a conflict about NATO expansion. Remember that NATO has gone through several rounds of increasing its membership over time. It was not always 30 members, and we talked about how a lot of those countries in Eastern Europe, like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, are now NATO members, but were former members of the Warsaw Pact. Russia didn't like that very much. So back when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, there were some discussions between the emerging Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, and US presidents and NATO member state heads about what the future of NATO looked like. There are some people in Russia who believe that they were promised that NATO would not expand too far to the east, that they would not incorporate former Soviet territories, that they would not be including Warsaw Pact members. And then in the late 1990s, like 1999, you start seeing increasing in NATO membership to include some of those states. The NATO members in the United States think that they, did not make that promise to not expand, that changes in the organization would not necessarily view Russia as an enemy, but one that would incorporate these countries into collective security that would make Europe overall a more peaceful place. In fact, there were people in the 1990s who were arguing that Russia should be invited to join NATO. So there's some disagreement about what that communication was, what that communication means in terms of promises and regarding NATO expansion. So two of the countries that Russia has invaded, Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine just recently, are countries that have at times considered joining NATO. Why do you think that Russia would dislike that? Yes?
Well, first of all, I was going to ask,
Sure.
Isn't it kind of like unfair for Russia to claim that it's like NATO expansionism if the countries are joining willingly?
So they think that these countries are in what's called their sphere of influence, right? That countries that they have ties to, that were part of, a union of socialist states at some point. There are even like historical moments where Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire back when it had like emperors and czars and whatnot. Ukraine has been owned by a bunch of different countries. Parts of it have been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire at some point. Parts of it have been owned by the Ottoman Empire. Parts of it have been owned by, part of it was a province of Russia, even though it's a country that has its own language, its own religion, it has distinctions in its culture from Russian culture. There are definitely times where, for a long period of time, Russia has considered at least parts of Ukrainian territory to be under its control. You'll also see that during the Cold War, Russia moved a large number of ethnic Russians into several Warsaw State members and members of the USSR. And so, depending on how you interpret some historical events, you might think that Russia deliberately caused a famine that killed about 6 to 8 million people in Ukraine in the early 1930s, pre-World War World War II. And there was another great big famine in Ukraine that happened right during the period of the Bolshevik Revolution. And so, when 8 million people have been killed, that created spaces for Moscow to move ethnic Russians into portions of Ukraine that now have a larger number of ethnic Russians as their population versus the people who have historically lived there. They also did things like attempt to destroy the Ukrainian language, made it so that you couldn't teach schools in Ukrainian, all kinds of stuff like that. And so now Russia likes to make claims like, we are protecting ethnic Russians in this country. There are people who share our ethnicity who are having their rights being violated because of things that Ukraine is doing. And that is like one of their justifications, which goes back to things that happened during the Cold War and the ways that Russia attempted to ensure that it had extended influence over members of the Soviet Union of the war's time. So why do they think they still have a claim? This kind of a long historical thing that is kind of just beyond, they were once our friends and now they're not our friends anymore. Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, so the other thing your question you said about how they, why would they run with data? I guess, kind of in a way, part of it is that they want to defend themselves from Russia. And like the fact that they're going, like, invading these countries and stuff, if anything, and this also applies to other countries like Sweden and Germany and stuff, that's like more of a motivator. It's kind of like, it's like, don't join this organization meant to protect you from me, because then I'll attack you.
Right. So these countries want to join NATO, right? Because they are westernizing. Sometimes they see the relationship between joining NATO as a military alliance and the EU as an economic alliance, as kind of joint ways of reforming their economy, political systems after the end of the Cold War, that they do see Russia as a potential threat, right? Like some of these countries, or parts of those countries' populations, were not like willingly part of the Soviet Union, but happened to be liberated by the USSR at the end of World War II. Some of these countries had, violent protests over the periods of the Cold War. Sometimes they had revolutions to, break free from the Soviet Union. So there is like political difference in these countries and their histories with Russia. Some of them see Russia more hostile than others. Some of them have had, fights for hundreds of years with Russia over different bits of territory, that sort of thing. So there's an argument that Russia invading these small portions of Georgia and the original taking the Crimean portion of Ukraine were warnings, right? These were warnings to those countries and to NATO that they shouldn't be allowed to join, because that would then create an Article 5 situation that would require NATO members to defend these countries in the future. And so NATO would have to think very carefully about whether they want Ukraine as a member, given the possibility that a real war could break out. Do they really want to extend security commitments to countries that have smaller economies, that are at larger risk of conflict with Russia over some of these disputed territories? There are also portions that require that you have settled some of your territorial disputes before you can become a member, and so Russia has some incentives to keep countries out by just kind of sitting there and making some parts of these countries' territories complicated under international law and making it hard or impossible for these countries to join NATO in the short term. Yes?
Just to add more information, the famine in Ukraine is told over, and the Ukrainians claim that it's like genocide and that's done. How is that for a genocide? It is just what countries do at the same time, like burning and stuff. What they do is because they want to build their industry, because they don't have money, so they need to exploit the agricultural population and then start and sell their agricultural products for the industry to develop their industry.
Yeah. So it definitely is something that has been debated about how deliberate the famines that happened in 1932, 1933 were, whether that was a genocide. Some of the information from that is difficult to obtain because of the way that the Soviet Union tried to hide things. Like, you couldn't get independent journalists into Ukraine during most of that period, right? So there isn't a lot of independent reporting on what was happening in that area. And so it's definitely something that historians debate about the motivations there. But I think that there is a pretty clear consensus on the idea that the fact that many people died in the famine made it possible to move ethnic Russians into these parts of Eastern Europe is not something that's very disputed. And so that's definitely something that has relevance now when Russia makes the argument that they're, defending Russians and Russian-speaking people in these countries. I warned you that there was potential for history tangents, so yeah.
So didn't the Soviet Union do a similar
So I think that there was definitely a moment in like the mid-90s where like NATO was like keen to expand to anybody who wanted to join, basically. And so I think the conversations along those lines were more likely to happen at that time. I'm not sure that as many Central Asian nations have expressed interest in joining themselves or have taken some of the proactive steps that they would need to in order to move in the direction of membership. But the United States and NATO member states often have agreements and cooperate in more limited capacities with Central Asian nations that are interested in that form of cooperation. That's not universal. There are some countries that consider themselves more aligned with Russia now and are not interested in that form of cooperation. But I think that there was probably a moment of that, rapid NATO expansion where there would have been potential for that to happen had there been like mutual interest and progress. Yes? Yeah, of course. All right, let's talk about some more people you should know. The guy with the angry eyebrows is Viktor Orban. He is the president of Hungary. He's been Prime Minister, not President. Prime Minister of Hungary since 2010. He was also the Prime Minister back in the 90s and back, when we thought history was ending and people were super optimistic. He was one of the first Eastern European politicians that didn't have their kind of power coming from their ties to the Communist Party in their country. He actually oversaw Hungary joining NATO back in 1999. But later, his politics have kind of changed a bit. In his second term, his party had a supermajority, which he used to push through a new constitution in 2012. It limited some things like judicial independence and the freedom of the press. He also has had some policies that are considered very conservative, including being very anti-LGBTQ. By his third term, which started in 2014, Orban was openly claiming that he wanted to make Hungary an illiberal democracy, more similar to Russia, China, and Turkey, countries where there aren't as many rights and freedoms that are protected by a constitution, but might still claim to be democracies, have elections, and those sorts of things. He has a much friendlier relationship with Putin than most other current NATO members. That includes refusing to impose sanctions on Russia for its recent invasion of Ukraine. And so Hungary is one of those countries that is, flying in the face of some of those democratic standards that are expected for NATO members. You will hear that talked about in some of your evidence that talks about the importance of democracy, of liberalism, of elections, and the need to protect those from cyber attacks and the like in your affirmative. It's also an example, right, where some NATO members will kind of do their own thing. Hungary is a potential country that could be a spoiler for policies that are, directed or could be considered anti-Russian or more in favor of democracy than some other countries. And so that's somebody you kind of need to know who that is, because that's a potential, we've talked a couple of times about we need consensus, everybody needs to get along, everybody needs to agree, that sort of thing. The other guy is Erdogan. He is the president of Turkey. Like Orban, he has tilted his country in a more authoritarian and populist direction, especially since a failed coup attempt that occurred in 2016. Turkey has a complicated relationship with NATO. It was not one of the original members, but was a highly desired member when it joined a few years later. It has a decent amount of tension with Greece over the status of Cyprus, which is the thing I mentioned earlier. It has purchased missile defense systems from Russia that other NATO member states have indicated would be a problem and could not be integrated safely with the rest of the members' missile defense systems and other technologies. It has threatened to block memberships for Finland and Sweden, two countries that have recently expressed increased interest in joining the organization after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But it's also considered a really important member of the alliance. It has the second largest military of any NATO member state. It hosts US tactical nuclear weapons, has a really important US Air Force base on their territory. It's considered really important for the US's access, or NATO's ability to access the Middle East. And so, NATO has been, it's definitely a country that has the potential to play a spoiler. It definitely is one of those countries that might have its own thoughts and opinions about the affirmative. It can be complicated to work with. It is a little more Russia-friendly than some other NATO member states right now. And so, it's definitely one that whether they should continue to be a member is something that gets debated in the literature because they're both a really important part of the organization and one that can be complicated for the organization's ability to achieve its goals. Yes?
I think a few years back they had a conflict where they shot down a Russian fighter jet. Are they still kind of like tense with Russia, or do they have more of an Orban relationship where they're kind of friendly with them?
The answer there is that it's complicated. So a lot of that stuff dealt with Syria. Russia was involved in backing one group in Syria. Turkey backed another group in Syria. Turkey tends to hate the Kurds more than just about anything, is another kind of factor in their political decision making. They don't love that the United States and some other, NATO members were supporting Kurdish people in the Syria conflict. That was a complicated situation, and one that was definitely kind of shows that Turkey is not just like on one side or another, but is kind of more playing both sides. It has some conflicts with Russia. I think most of the Syria situation has simmered down, and so I think the odds of a shooting conflict between Turkey and Russia anytime in the near future is pretty limited. But that's kind of what that was about. They tend to get mad at the United States for not declaring the Kurds terrorists. That is another kind of situation where Turkey sometimes expresses that they feel that NATO doesn't always work for them. Like they have expressed interest in invoking collective self-defense and Article 4 cooperation in some situations that has not been supported by other members of the organization. Okay, I've talked for an hour and 45 minutes. What questions do you all have for me? Because I've given you kind of a lot of information about the topic as a whole, some of the things that you want to be looking for when crafting a big affirmative, how NATO works, what some of those areas might be, the things that you want to be looking for if you're trying to craft a strategic affirmative on this topic are a reason why NATO is important, right? Like why the United States can't just do this thing on its own, why it can't just work bilaterally or needs to work through NATO as an organization, which is why our camp affirmative is one that has a really good NATO key warrant about Article 5. And I think that that's kind of the better limiter than a lot of the different terms that are used in the resolution, our counterclaims. And so definitely something to keep in mind. What questions do you all have? Yes?
Do we know if any of the other development of NATO ones that are going to be common out of Article 5?
Article 5 is the biggest one, or just I found someone who said it's important to fight against Russia, or to make NATO relevant. There were definitely people who were writing in the early 2000s about NATO's need to find a mission. I'm not sure if people are still writing that given the Ukraine invasion and kind of the tilt back to deter Russia, deter Russia, deter Russia. I think if you look at some older stuff, NATO needs something to do would have been another potential warrant why it should work through NATO, but that's probably older now. Yeah.
So could it not be trying to introduce a new article that could have importance?
You could. That would. I'm not.
I understand the issues of it.
Right.
The way all the votes.
Yep. Complicated, but I suppose that could exist as an example of what a NATO key warrant might be. Is we need to change the thing about the treaty. Sure, could be not pretty, but that's the case. And dealt with one of these things. So it's kind of a weird we got to find a set of cards that go together is the challenge of this topic. Yes.
Do you think that there'll be any European elections just that, individual countries elections just that? I just don't know if there are any elections coming up this year.
France just had one. Germany just had one. They are the kind of two biggest. I have written little tiny European elections decides. Before the challenge there is European elections are more likely to be